I had a friend, really good friend, say to me, he said, I feel like I find out about your struggles by reading about them in a book or listening to one of your sermons. What's he saying to me? He's saying, hey, we get together for breakfast. We sit on your front porch. You don't share those things with me, but you share them in the stage or you put them in a book. And what I was confronted with was this question of why is it harder for me to share it with him?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us. Hey, today I am sitting down with Kyle Idleman. What do you do when you want to punch a hole in the wall? Well, we talk about that. We're going to talk about vulnerability, insecurity, the spiritual gift of disappointing people. And hey, I've got something brand new for you that I'm really excited about. We're doing show notes in a different way. So obviously here on YouTube, you can see what we're doing. There's get detailed notes and everything. But if you really want to dive into everything, go to careynieuwhof.com/show notes. And something really cool is going to happen. Not only are you going to be getting access to the show notes for this episode, you'll get them for all of the episodes of the podcast, and you'll become a member of the free tier of my Art of Leadership Academy. And what I'm doing there, this is beyond YouTube comments, is we're creating an environment for like-minded church leaders to come together and just have a conversation about the stuff that's on your heart, stuff that you might not feel comfortable, dropping into the YouTube comments. We're going to have it right there. So why don't you sign up right now? Go to careynieuwhof.com/show notes, and you'll get all of that and more. In the meantime, like, subscribe, leave a comment to join the conversation. And now, a word from today's partners, and then we'll dive into my conversation with Kyle Idleman. Hey, this episode is brought to you by the Art of Leadership Academy. So if this podcast is part of your growth and rhythm in leadership, I think you're going to love what I'm going to share with you. Inside my Art of Leadership Academy, we have just opened up a few brand new spaces for you to lead more effectively and grow your leadership. And the price, you're going to love it. It's absolutely free. So what I would love for you to do is go and set up your free account today, because you're going to be able to join a life-giving online community. Think social media, but only for pastors and church leaders who are looking to grow and support each other. You can cut the noise, the trolls, the junk you get everywhere else. Actually, it's just a community of church leaders who really care about the mission of the church. I would love for you to be involved. And the big part of this is you'll be able to connect with other podcast listeners about each episode of my podcast, including me. I'm going to be active on there. You'll get exclusive insights by asking questions, sharing insights, and learning how others are applying what they're learning on this podcast to real life situations in their church and ministry or their business. So everything you get will help you lead more effectively, to grow faster and thrive in life and leadership. I'd love for you to get started today, and here's how you do it. Create a free account. It's pretty simple. Click the link in the description of this episode or visit theartofleadershipacademy.com. Couple clicks, you're in. It's free. Look forward to seeing you inside. Today's episode is brought to you by Church.Tech. Hey, pastors, social, is today's front door, but slicing and dicing your sermon clips can swallow a whole day, not to mention like entire staff resources. So to make sure that your church can keep up to date, what about trying AI? Clips are just the beginning. Church.Tech is the most complete pastoral AI suite anywhere. Instant discipleship guides, outreach plans, kidsmin content, and more. 5 minutes of setup wins back hours each week to meet people and make disciples. So if you're ready to trade editing and staff time for actual ministry, visit Church.Tech. Use the code CAREY, my name, CAREY, for 50% off your first 3 months. Reach more people, spend more time discipling people. That's Carey, gets you 50% off by going to Church.Tech. Well, Kyle, welcome back. Really good to have you.
Great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
I always enjoy my time with you. And last time, we talked about a sabbatical you took. That was a big surprise. I heard so much about that episode. And you and I have talked about it a little bit since then. Like, the bottom line for those who missed the episode is you thought you needed a couple weeks off, and people were tapping you on the shoulder going, maybe a little bit longer, and it needed and healthy and good. What have the last few years since then been like, and what have you learned in the interim?
Well, I've learned that sabbatical is not necessarily a friendly word now. There's like when it gets mentioned, I feel just a little bit of a twitch. It was a time where I thought, hey, a month break would be great. My elders said, hey, I think a little longer break would be helpful, and they were right, but that was hard. One of the things that I have learned in the time since, or through that experience, was that you don't necessarily feel, or at least for me, I didn't necessarily feel the weight of a season until I'm on the other side of it, which maybe you don't know that until you go through it the hard way. But in the middle of it, I think I'm doing good. My energy's good. I feel motivated. I'm ready. I'm very focused on, getting through or reaching a goal. And I think I'm in a really healthy place. And then the unhealth gets exposed once you're through. And I didn't expect that. You wouldn't think that once you cross a finish line, like that's when it hits you. You would expect, to feel pretty worn out during the race. And then when it's over, just feel relieved that I made it. I did it. I accomplished, I persevered. But recognizing sometimes the weight of a season doesn't really hit you until you're on the other side of it. And I found that to be true, which helps me be more intentional now when I'm in the middle of it. I'll tell you one other thing that I really learned that I don't know if very many people can relate to this. I suspect a lot of your listeners probably could, but I have a tendency to be positive, like about everything, which most of the time is a strength, but not always, right? Like it makes me not always an accurate perceiver of how I'm doing or how a conversation goes. Sometimes I get done with a hard conversation, and if you ask me, I'd be like, "Oh, it went great, went really well," but it didn't, and so I have learned to, kind of pay attention to my positivity. That is most of the time that's a leadership strength. It's often, the kind of spirit that somebody wants to follow. But man, if you're not accurately perceiving where you're at, where your health is at, where your relationships are at, that's not healthy at all. And so my, proclivity to positivity is something I'm learning to question and not just assume. So when I hear myself saying, "Hey, that went great," stepping back and asking some other people, "How do you think that went?" And that's been new. I don't. A few years ago, I didn't recognize the need for that. Can you relate to that? Having that perspective.
I think I'm always doing better than I am. I think I can relate to that. I was talking to a buddy. Okay. I don't know whether you know him yesterday, but he checked in with me maybe 6 months ago. And then again yesterday. We just been through a natural disaster here in our part of the country and, lost most of my backyard, cut down dozens and dozens of trees without hydro, without internet, blah, blah, blah. He's like, "How you doing?" And I'm like, ooh, that's the second "how you doing" call I got from my friend in California in 6 months. And so I'm leaving tomorrow for a week away and I'm thinking, maybe I need a longer break. Like I'm going to take a month off this summer. But there's always that sense, and I don't know, feel free to go, "Carey, that's a dumb question. Let's move on." But, back to that sabbatical a couple of years ago, did it feel like you were being benched? I know it was, kind of voluntary. You took it. You weren't forced.
Yeah, halfway through it did. It did. Initially, I think I was really glad for the break and to catch my breath and be restored. Just physically, emotionally, being able to focus on, some family things, but about halfway through, I felt the weight of this isn't. I didn't want it to be this long, and I'm ready to get back. And and maybe some of that struggle of you don't necessarily feel for the first month, but then in that second month, some of where you found your identity that you didn't know you found your identity begins to surface and gets exposed that didn't really show up in the first month, but it does in the second. So initially it didn't feel that way, but halfway through it did feel a little that way.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because when we were reflecting on it for the first time, and I've thought about our conversation a lot, even, doing hundreds and hundreds of episodes, some conversations are really memorable. I really love that one that we had a few years ago. I'm like, I don't think I ever want to be benched. And that's an issue, right? That's an issue. If someone said, hey, you need a few months off. I'm going to be, part of me is going to be, actually, no, I don't. And you can leave right now.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like that picture of being benched because, a good basketball player will recognize when they need that, but that comes with maturity. Meaning, like you never, when you're young, you never want to come out of the game. Don't take me out of the game. When you get a little bit older,
put me in, coach, right?
Right. You recognize, hey, the team's going to be better if I take some time on the bench, right? And so there's a sign of maturity, I think, in a recognition that I can be on the bench. It's okay. But nobody wants, to carry that metaphor out. It's one thing to say to the coach, I could use a break. It's another thing for the coach to say to you, you could use a break. And, right, like those are two different conversations.
We were talking about our counselors / performance coaches before we hit record, right? Depending on who I'm talking to, counselor or performance coach. Anyway, and he's been encouraging me to hit the brake more often and not the gas pedal. And there's something, Dr. C, maybe you're listening, that I really resent about that. Yes, it came out. I resent about it and I resist about it. And I maybe have to think about that. Are there warning signs now? Like, think about your life as a series of dashboard lights. Do you have dashboard lights that you're aware of now, 2 years later, a couple of years later, that maybe you weren't paying attention to before the break?
I would say a couple of things that might be new for me that have showed up on the dashboard that I pay closer attention now than I used to. Would be when I struggle with empowering some of the people around me. I recognize that now as more of a me thing than a them thing. And when that becomes hard for me, it lets me know, man, I'm holding on to this in a way that's not going to be healthy. And so now when I start to question some competencies or some performances of staff, it helps me to see that might be within me. I'm holding on to something that I don't need to hold on to that tightly. And if I keep doing that with too many people, that's going to wear me out. It's going to create problems. The other one for me, I would say, is how am I receiving feedback? Generally speaking, I'm not easily offended. For the most part, I do fine with criticism and feedback, but not always. And when I am feeling sensitive and when I'm feeling defensive, when I'm having a hard time receiving that from people, that to me, that's a light on the dashboard that says, okay, you need to lean in. So.
Well, we're going from easy topic to easy topic. Your latest focus, you talk a lot about insecurity, Kyle, and it's something I think the two of us can relate to. And I think a lot of leaders, like on the one hand, you have the narcissists. And, from what I know about narcissism, that can be rooted in insecurity. You don't present as a narcissist, but insecurity has been part of your journey. How has it been part of your life and then your life as a leader, Kyle?
It's an interesting conversation because I am insecure about my insecurity. I don't like being thought of as insecure, and that's rooted in insecurity, right?
Yeah.
So I would say for a long time, I perceived the struggle of insecurity as someone who lacks confidence, someone that doesn't make eye contact, someone that, won't speak up or step up when needed. And so because I associated insecurity that way, I didn't acknowledge or recognize that was a struggle for me. But for me, it wasn't a lack of confidence. It was let me put it this way. It wasn't self-doubt. It was self-consciousness. that I was my self-consciousness was rooted in insecurity. But that to me, that's different than lacking confidence. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, like you kind of knew, okay, I'm a decent leader. I'm a decent communicator. I can write.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I knew those things, and I felt confident when called upon, but I was self-conscious about it, meaning that how that's being perceived and received by other people. I did struggle with feelings of inadequacy at different times, but they would be rooted in self-consciousness. Let me give you just a real quick example. I might ask you to edit this out. I don't know. I've probably got 6 or 7 podcasts that I'm doing this week. Mm-hmm. This is the only one I feel insecure about. And It's because I know that, it has nothing to do with our conversation but it has to do with, I know who your listeners are. I know they're peers of mine. I know they do what I do. I respect them as leaders. I know the kind of people you have on your podcast. And so I'm more aware of how I'm being perceived in a conversation like this. I think about that more than I would in other podcasts, right? Which to me is what I'm talking about here. It is, this insecurity that's rooted in self-consciousness around, what certain people, how they perceive you. Now, what helped me about this so much is just seeing that there's this Moses and David and the list of people who dealt with feelings of inadequacy are pretty long, and recognizing that, acknowledging insecurity actually earns respect. Like, I don't have to be, like, even just sharing the example I did about being on here. I know enough now to know that people who are listening to this, they don't lose respect when they hear me say that, right? But for so many years, I would not have wanted to share that. Because I didn't understand that. And now if I'm listening to your podcast and I hear someone talk about an area of struggle or something that they're insecure about, I know my respect for them, goes up. And so, biblically, this is where Paul's talking about, my, his strength is made perfect in my weakness, therefore I will delight in my weakness. And recognizing that, okay, when I can acknowledge these things, I'm not losing credibility, even though it can feel like that. And if that makes sense.
It's such a paradox, man. And I can relate to that as well. And, the way I'm sitting, I'm like, hey, man, I'm in my basement. Like, what can be intimidating? But you're right. There's some really influential people who listen to this podcast and the guests we have on this podcast. But, it's that paradox, Kyle, that I have felt as well. It's like, oh, can I really share this? Can I really? And particularly, if it's 20 years in the rearview mirror, go ahead and share it. But if it's like right now, a real nerve, it's kind of like, But whenever some leader I know that I respect shares out of their weakness, my admiration and my sense of closeness gets better. Like our last conversation, which I promise I will stop referencing at some point in this conversation, was really unscripted, and it was a surprise. It was sort of a throwaway question that became the meat of the interview, and you were so vulnerable. And I mean, I remember it so well, and it resonated with so many leaders. But you're right, there's that tension. And I feel it where I feel it, just so, you're not alone on this one, is when you get in, you and I are in green rooms all the time, and I'm getting over it now, but for many, many years, if there was pastor of a very large church or somebody that I've followed for years, or I've read their books, or, whatever, and they show up, I would be like both drawn to them, like I gotta go and shake his hand. I gotta go. Right. I gotta say hi, and also absolutely terrified at the same time.
Yeah,
they're going to see that there's nothing here, So that kind of insecurity, I definitely feel, and it's, I had a few friends who've said to me, and it's such a fine line between like narcissism and insecurity. But they're like, no, you belong at that table. You belong at that room. And I'm like, no, I don't think I do. But I'm gradually more comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well, and, The beautiful thing about the gospel in this is the confidence doesn't come from having to convince myself that I belong at the table. It comes from recognizing God's strength and how he wants to use me is up to him. Well, here, the example that comes to my mind is of when God calls Moses. Moses says, I'm not a good speaker. Moses says, I don't belong at the table. And God doesn't say, well, yes, you are a good speaker. You do belong there. He says, I made your tongue. In other words, I'm the one who will give you what you need in those moments and for those put your confidence in me. And, learning to do that is the challenge.
How did your, looking back on your life so far, when in the rearview mirror, when do you think you first felt insecure? Was it something you grew up with? Was there an incident in elementary or high school, just part of your DNA? Like, when did that first surface in your life?
Well, I don't put this on my parents because I think it's the way I interpreted it. But there was always an awareness of how are you being perceived? What do people think? And I, honestly, not in like an unhealthy way or not in a hypocritical, pharisaical way, but just in a way that growing up, I put a lot of weight in that, and then ministry has a way of creating more of that, right? Like
that was one of my questions. So did ministry make it worse? It wasn't really a question. Of course, ministry made it worse.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think surface that, right? Yeah. You've got public scrutiny. So it's not just ministry. Any leadership role that is in the spotlight is going to bring more scrutiny. It's just going to bring more awareness that other people are seeing or talking or whatever it is. So I think ministry brings that to, and by the way, you can be at a church of 200 people and that's still very real. And then I think ministry also intensifies it because you've got sometimes these unclear expectations or these unclear metrics where you don't know if you're ever quote unquote successful, right? Like it can be difficult to measure success in ministry. And by the way, if you get too wrapped up in the metrics as a way to not feel this way, then you're really going to feel that way. Does that make sense? Like if you're looking at all these attendance numbers or, giving, and if you look at those as a way to not feel insecure, like, well, we hit this and hit this, by putting your confidence in those metrics, you're going to especially feel insecure. Which I'm not sure is true in every organization, right? I think a lot of times those metrics I don't know. But in ministry, certainly, I think the unclear metrics.
What makes you, because you do lead one of the largest churches in the nation. You've been very successful at what you do. What makes you say when you measure that way, it leaves you unhappy, like unfulfilled?
Well, I was having a conversation. This is when I was an intern, so it's going back a while. But I was having a conversation with the guy who was essentially the founding pastor of this church. His name's Bob Russell. Mm-hmm. And at the time, the church was maybe running around 12,000. And he had a conversation with me where he said, I thought when we hit 10,000 as a church, then that would, I'd be like, oh, well, we made it. But then he traced that back. He said, but then I thought that when we were going to get 5,000, then I thought that when we were close to 1,000, he kind of reverse engineered the fact that doesn't go away if that's what you're looking at, if that's where you're trying to find a sense of security while we reach that number. And I remember that really well, that conversation, and just recognizing that if you're finding security in that, man, it's a moving target. And I think that's probably true in a lot of areas. Like if from a net worth standpoint, you might think, well, if I reach this place, I'm going to feel secure. And you hit that place and it's like, well, okay, now if it's this place,
yes, the line moved once.
The line moves. Yeah. And so if you put your security in metrics that are always moving, then you always feel insecure. And there's a lot of moving metrics within a church. And even if they're healthy, going up and to the right, it's still moving. And wherever you're at now pales into comparison of where you might be a year from now. So I think those moving metrics, and by the way, now we measure everything, and I'm for that. Like, I think it's super helpful and informative. I'm for measuring everything, but there are that many more opportunities to find your confidence in different things or lack thereof. As you measure so many different things within the organization.
No, it's so funny. When I was a kid watching baseball, it was like you kind of knew their batting average and maybe number of home runs, RBIs, that kind of thing. Now it's like, when he's third at bat and wearing blue socks and, right. The relative humidity is at 98%, he tends to hit X number of home runs. It's like, what? Yeah. It's like,
that'll make you insecure.
They got a metric for everything, right? Yeah, and he struck out. Okay. Yeah. So ministry intensified it. And you've been very vulnerable in this new book, and we'll tell people about it at the end, but what are some parts of being Kyle Idleman that people do not see?
I would say they don't see what's a good way to say this? They don't see the tired version of me very often. I could even be more specific there. They don't see a tired husband and father. They assume that because I am a engaged leader that is, that I'm that way all the time. And that's not all the time true. I sometimes feel like I stay very engaged throughout the day, and then I go home and lay on the couch and scroll on my phone, right? And so I think sometimes people don't see that. They don't see the morning doubt is maybe the best way to say it, where you wake up kind of questioning. Am I the right person for this? Kind of in seasons, it can feel like a daily process where you kind of wrestle with that at the beginning of the day, where you have to take those thoughts captive because they meet you there in the morning. But you don't want to carry that with you as a leader. You're like, you don't want to be that guy when you walk in. So that comes to my mind is just
what makes you think even now that you might not be the right person?
I'm around such competent leaders, and I see skill sets that I don't think I have. I'll give you an example of this. Is I trust my gut a lot of times on decisions, and I've been in leadership roles for a long time. I think I can often know the next right step or have a sense of what's around the corner, but I'm not super strategic, and I get to spend some time with people who are really strategic, and I'm like, oh man, that's what we need as an organization right now. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have that gear. And so I think there's that. Well, I mean, that's comparison stuff, which I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily do that with a jealous spirit, but just like an awareness of I'm not sure that I have that gift that is required, and understanding what that means for us as a church. Learning to depend on other people and ask for help. And, did you ever read the book, what's it called? Rocket Fuel? Am I getting that right?
I think I have. No.
I may be missing the name. Well, it just talks about how you finding your right balance, the person that you bring strengths that you don't have. But in order to find that person, you have to really know what those weaknesses are for you, which is a hard journey to go on.
Okay, I get the idea. I haven't read the book.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the public version of me that people don't necessarily see is probably the tired or the doubting. I'm not sure if I've got what I need for this. Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that you spent some time on your project to tackle the thought life of a Christian, thought life of a leader. If we were to meet you on a Sunday morning backstage before you preach to tens of thousands of people, what's going through your mind?
I'm glad you asked this question because I'd like to address the sometimes online hate for green rooms. I frankly resent that. If you're a good pastor, you'll never be in the green room, that backstage room. And listen, I understand the heart of that. Like, I think accessibility is one of the most important gauges for, your heart as a ministry leader. I think being accessible is super important. But I also would recognize that the green room is not a place, if you're healthy in what you're doing on a Sunday morning, it's not a place to escape or to be away from people. It is a place to get your head right, your heart right, to get on your knees and ask God for help. It's a place to find your confidence in Him. And so I resent it a little bit. Like, after I'm done preaching, I try to be accessible. But before I preach, it really helps me to have some quiet time with God where I am taking my thoughts captive and I'm thinking through, what's my spirit here? What's my heart here? I'm not just walking out there. Because one of the things I know is in those moments, leading up to stepping out on stage, if I don't have some intentionality ahead of time, it can catch me off guard. Like, I know anyone who does much speaking up front knows that feeling where you think you're confident and then you get up there and you suddenly have this, I should have prepared more for this message.
I'm not ready.
I'm not ready. I'm going to blow this opportunity. And, I know I'm going to be vulnerable to that, which means that I need to spend some time before going out, making sure that, I am preparing my mind to take those thoughts captive. So when they come, I can wrestle them to the ground. I've already, been praying a prayer. One of the prayers, I don't know where I heard this, but the prayer is, God, I'm the vessel, not the source. I'm the vessel, not the source. And just getting my heart in that right gear, having my mind, like, that takes so much pressure off of me when I really believe that. On our wall backstage, we have a lyric from one of our worship songs of, we bring the offering, but you bring the flame. Like, okay, God, I am bringing the offering, but whatever happens with this is by your power. So finding that mindset and being intentional to do that before stepping out makes a big difference. Do you have a routine before you get out of kind of?
No, it's funny. I didn't know where you were going with the. I gotta take on this thing about green rooms. I have a very similar MO. I love being out in the lobby, but not before I speak. Now, if I'm at a conference and I've given the keynote because I've written a book on it, that's a different thing. But you're getting up there green, never delivered this message, never delivered this word before. I would hide in my office and just get ready and get my heart.
You're not playing video
ready.
Games in there.
Well, yeah, you could. Maybe that would be a better option for the church some Sundays than hearing me. But no, I would do that because, and then I would sneak in like right after the first worship song had started and go stand at the front. And then honestly, just transparently, half engage in worship. I know I shouldn't do that, but like, I'm just getting my head in the game. And I prepared, weeks in advance and the night before and the morning of. I'm up at 4:45 if I'm preaching in time for a 9 a.m. service. So, I mean, it's not like I just woke up and got out of bed. But yeah, there's something about that is very fearsome and a nervousness before I get up. Not like, oh, I'm speaking in public, but nervousness as of this isn't my word. Like, Well, so I feel that. And
awareness that there's a lot at stake,
there's a lot at stake. And it's somebody's first Sunday, it's somebody's last Sunday, the whole deal. But talk about that because, you do lead a very, very large church. You like to be in the lobby after the service. I was with Ashley Woolrich, our mutual friend, a couple of weeks ago. And, one of the largest churches in the country, top 3, maybe second largest. Yeah. And he's out there after the service, meeting people, greeting people, very accessible. No entourage, that kind of thing. And you have a very similar vibe. Why do you like to be out with people after the service?
I will have times where I'll just stand out in the lobby and shake hands and say hi to people. But one of the things I like to do is I like to go to our room where people come for prayer and they come for decisions.
Yeah.
And then I like to be able to sit down one-on-one with them at a table and pray for them, talk to them. Because sometimes when you're out in the lobby, you're getting connected. You're talking to the same people each time, right? And
the
so
church people all know where to find you.
Yeah. And you're like, didn't we just have the same conversation last week? And that's fine. But when you're in the what we call our decision area, or when you're in an area where people are at a spiritual intersection, and you can sit down with them at a time of need and you pray for them, and or you talk to them about a decision that they're making. It's that one at a time energy that I really need. Like that centers me as a pastor, that helps me with my message. When I sit down on Thursday and I talk to someone whose life was impacted in a certain way that maybe I didn't even mean to be a part of, but the Holy Spirit connected, I'll schedule sometimes between services back in that decision room, 15-minute prayer appointments where I'll talk to somebody, pray for them. And so that time is meaningful. And it also helps me with my next message, knowing how I want to lean in.
Okay, so I have to ask you this. How does that work? Okay, so how many people total? You have a big attendance, but how many people total would call Southeast their home?
Well, at that one campus where I am where it's a broadcast campus, it would be around 11 or 12,000.
Yeah, but total global with all the locations?
Total, maybe around 45,000.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. And you're like, I'll meet with anybody? So there are people who pastor churches of 200 who feel overwhelmed. I got to ask the question, how does that actually work out in real life?
Well, first of all, I tell you that. I don't announce that. Like,
you're not there. Hey, I'm going to meet with anybody. My phone number is, my cell is,
Yeah, so I don't announce it. But if someone calls,
wait for inbound.
Yeah. And sometimes, it's amazing how many times if somebody wants to meet with you about something and if it's an urgent pastoral care need, I'll make sure, to connect them to somebody right away. I don't want to, but oftentimes they're happy to wait a couple weeks to sit down and visit. So.
This episode is brought to you by Gloo. Well, pastors, I've subscribed to a new free text newsletter called the Gloo Feed. It's a quick hit of the latest research, polls, and updates in the church ecosystem. What I love is it saves me hours. Instead of hunting down info, it just shows up on my phone. So I've got Brad Hill, Chief Solutions Officer at Gloo, here to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, Carey, the Gloo Feed, it's really changing the game for staying up to date with all that's going on across the church today. And you're exactly right. What you said, it's what's happening with the Gloo Feed is we're evolving the way pastors and leaders stay informed. We're connecting the whole faith ecosystem across churches and ministries nationwide. And we kind of do the heavy lifting so that you get all the latest trends, information, updates from the leaders that you trust. You get these short, curated, helpful texts. No long emails, no irrelevant noise, just the things, that you want to know. One leader even shared with us recently, the Gloo Feed is the one text that I actually want to get every week. It's everything I need to serve my church better in one place.
I think curated content is more and more important in a world that's drowning in content. It doesn't get any easier than the Gloo Feed. So you can join for free. It takes about 5 seconds. Here's what you do. Text my name, Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, to 46816. That's Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, to 46816. Just to follow that rabbit trail, how many of those meetings are worthwhile, and how many of those meetings, percentage-wise, are you like, shouldn't have taken that one? What do you find?
If it's a pastoral need, like if it's somebody who has a serious faith question, or they're going through a struggle with their teenager, or their marriage is having some issues, like I'm amazed how a 10-minute conversation and a prayer can be so productive. And then I'll have somebody follow up with them, and walk with them in a more meaningful way. But
so there's been a little bit of vetting. Like, do you ask, what do you want to meet with me about? If somebody's like,
yeah.
oh, I read this amazing book and you should change your whole theology, you're probably not taking that meeting.
Yeah, I don't usually meet with or out-of-town seminary students. You want to stay away from them. So there is some vetting that goes on.
Okay, good to know. No, that, you know what? It's this stuff that takes us out sometimes and makes us lose our enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. So, yes. Kyle, you also admitted that you have the spiritual gift of disappointing people. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think from a leadership perspective, one of the things I was not prepared for is making decisions where at least it feels like every potential outcome and direction is going to disappoint someone in ways that you could not have possibly anticipated. And so you think, okay, I can navigate this, or here's a decision that we can work through. And then you find out that, somebody somewhere is disappointed, and it can be exhausting if you're trying to always make at least somebody happy based upon direction and decision. And so I feel the weight of that at times, where I just think, man, all I did today was disappoint people. And I look at Jesus, and he disappointed a lot of people. Like you could certainly make the case that he disappointed a number of the disciples who had their idea of what a Messiah should be. He disappointed religious leaders. He disappointed the rich young ruler when he told him what he didn't want to hear. Recognizing that effective ministry and leadership is, you can't do it in a way that doesn't disappoint you. People are going to be disappointed. I would say, practically speaking, like let me use our staff as an example. One of the things I didn't really understand is that there's an opportunity in disappointing people to gain respect, meaning that you disappoint them because of maybe you didn't do things the way they wanted, or a decision or direction didn't go the way they hoped, but they appreciate clear direction. And by trying to be ambiguous or not make a decision, that's more disappointing to people. And so, embracing this is going to disappoint the person, but it's an opportunity to gain some respect. That helped me to see it that way.
How do you decide who to disappoint?
It's a great question. It doesn't, to me, so much of it doesn't feel like a choice. I will say the mistake I've made is choosing to disappoint, my wife, or disappoint one of my kids, because I didn't want to disappoint a church member or a staff person. Is a bad trait, and it can feel like it's okay to disappoint them because it's their job to accept me and forgive me, and so it doesn't. I would say most of the time it doesn't feel like a choice, but there's probably your question's a great question, because if I stopped and really looked at it, there's probably more choice to it than I would want to acknowledge, and too oftentimes you end up disappointing the people that will be most understanding. And it's a good question.
Such a great reminder too. I've done that way too many times, where I've disappointed the people closest to me for the sake of somebody who I might never talk to again. Yeah. When you think about your thought life, why did you write about your thought life?
A couple of reasons. First, there's a personal journey to it that I wanted to grow in. I don't know, when you write, there's a sense in which you have other people in mind that about the journey they're on, and then you also know your own growth and what is needed in your life. And I enjoy writing about something where I want to help people, but I also know it's something that needs attention. And so for me, there's that balance. I have had a harder time. I turned 49 last month, and I would say thank you. I'd say generationally, I was not really prepared for different distractions on the level that I struggled with in more recent years.
What do you mean by distractions?
Yeah. So I watch my kids. So I've got 4 kids in their 20s, and I watch them, and they do better with how they manage social media than I do. And, you wouldn't think that, but they grew up enough with it that they recognize, how these boundaries are important, and like how they'll call me on it more than I'll call them on it. They do better at managing some of their screen time than I do. And I've found that, people in my age range, they weren't prepared for it. They didn't necessarily see it coming. And so some, their life can be dominated by some of those distractions. And I could feel that. I could just feel the fact that I need to be a lot more intentional. I'll give you just a practical example of this. In the mornings, I got into this really bad routine of, waking up and checking my phone and reading the news. I can be a little bit of a news junkie, watching a few YouTube stories or reels, and, kind of starting my day that way. And I just began to recognize, like, okay, that if that's how I start my day, then I'm kind of wiring my thought life to be anxious and reactive throughout the day. If I recognize the importance or the priority of those morning thoughts, I'm gonna be so much more intentional. And then I started researching that, and I saw how consistent in Scripture morning time priority was for Jesus, for leaders. And then I was reading some neuroscience about how your brain in the mornings, you're setting trajectory for your thoughts for the rest of the day. Like what you think about when you first wake up has a way of wiring your brain for certain emotions or different thinking throughout the day. And so I kind of put that together with the scriptural mandate and some of what we know about science, and began to practice that in my own life. And I've just become convinced, like, this is huge. Like if you as a pastor, if I can talk to our church about the first 5 or 10 minutes of their day, taking their thoughts captive and being intentional with their thinking, it is life-changing. I really believe that this is true. It doesn't even take that much time. So let me nail this down a little bit more. Like if I take an hour around, lunch, that's good. But I would argue that taking 10 minutes when I first wake up bears more fruit spiritually, emotionally, relationally, mental health, than if I take an hour later in the day. And so some of those things that I have learned that I think are biblically consistent, but then also backed up with research, have really impacted me, and so I wanted to write about that.
Well, being 49, you have some pre-digital memory, right? I definitely do.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And there really wasn't an option to scroll our phones 25 years ago. There's nothing to scroll. There's nothing to see, right? Maybe you check your voicemail, but nobody really woke up and checked their voicemail. Like it just didn't happen, right?
Oh, yeah. Did you ever have a pager?
What's that? Yeah, your
Did
pager,
you ever have
right? Oh, my pager went off at 3 a.m. What did I do? I missed that one. I never had a pager. But I know most of our listeners don't really have a pre-digital memory, but, did you notice a big shift with the advent of technology on how you felt during the day?
It was subtle. I think that's one of the reasons it caught me off guard, where, suddenly it's an issue. But I've also discovered that there are tools let me tell you about this app that I've been using called ClearSpace. And the way it's set up is you put the camera on your phone on you, and then it counts how many push-ups you do or how many squats you do, and then it gives you 1 minute of screen time for every push-up or squat that you do, and which is awesome.
Not a minute of push-ups. It's just one push-up equals 1 minute.
One push-up equals 1 minute, which my son thinks is too generous, but it's not. It's not. And so I love the fact that here's a device that can sometimes be demonized as the source of distraction, but it can also be used, as a discipleship tool or as a tool to help me be more disciplined. And so I've been doing that recently, of starting my day off, 25 push-ups, 25 squats. That gives me 50 minutes of screen time, on these different apps, and using some of that to help me be more disciplined with my distractions.
That's great. I actually put myself on restriction at New Year's. I'm like, all right, only so much news, I capped it. So much social media, I capped it. Sometimes I blow by the limits because you can hit that button. But for the most part, I try to stay within them. It's funny, on my bad days, I'm more like, oh, I've earned this. And it's better than hitting the pantry. But I mean, it's a battle for all of us. So your thought life goes in a few different directions. I think a lot of us, Kyle, struggle with destructive thoughts, lies. What are some of the most damaging lies you've had to contend with in your life as a pastor?
Yeah, we touched on this a bit, but I would say this idea that my identity or my worth is connected to measurable outcomes. You know, it's the performance-based identity is all it is. But you know, that lie is especially dangerous for someone in spiritual leadership specifically because that lie can masquerade as spiritual success. You know, where I look at it and say, well, I must be spiritually healthy because of this fruit that's being produced. And so I think that the lie can be especially dangerous for people in those roles. And when I am caught up in that lie, this goes back to our initial conversation about sabbatical. You know, I start living in leadership rhythms that are driven by production rather than connection. I think we sometimes stop short of the connection conversation. We just say, you know, don't be so caught up in, you know, the measurables. But it's not just. It's also a connection. It's measuring, you know, where I'm at, not by what I've produced, but by the connections in my life, my connection with God, my connection with, you know, my wife, with other people. And I just find that to be very difficult in this role because everything, the production things feel so important and feel so worthwhile. You know, one of our mantras as a church staff is be the branch from John 15, verse 5, where, you know, Jesus says, yeah, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you'll bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can't do anything. And, you know, in his final moments with the disciples, his focus with them is not on production. Here's all, you know, here's your 5-year plan of everything you need to accomplish to, you know, carry out the Great Commission. It's connection. It's like, hey, I'll be the vine, you be the branch. And if you do that, you're going to bear much fruit. But I feel like that's a constant struggle. There's something deep within me that will, you know, that neural pathway is well established in my mind that what I got done today, what I produced today measures me and rather than connection.
That's a really powerful insight and something, you know, I'm a performance addict. I get totally caught up in that. How do you disentangle production from connection? How are you doing that?
Well, I think part of the lie is that, you know, that makes it even more dangerous is that I think production is what earns me connection.
Yeah. Oh.
That you know, that if I produce enough, that Jesus, that's what connects me to Jesus. I do.
Good job.
This so in my,
good job,
I do
Kyle.
This good job. Now we're connected because you got this done. And one of the moments for me that brought this home was I came home from work, maybe been a year or two ago, and my wife and I, that time of year, would often go for walks in the evening. But the grass, you'll appreciate this, the grass really needed to be mowed. And
it always.
And in
needs
my
to be
mind,
mowed.
And in my mind, I'm like, okay, if I mow the grass, I'll have number one, I'll have something to show for it. I can point to it. I can say, look what I got done today. And it'll connect me to my wife because she'll be so glad that the grass got mowed. And so, honey, I'm not going to go on a walk like we had planned. Because if I go on a walk, I got nothing to show for it. We just went on a walk. You know, we ended up where we started. Like nothing tangibly. You can't point to it. You just went for a walk. Yeah. And then I started to just recognize how that is how I am often in my relationship with God. Of like, okay, God, I can't walk with you right now because the grass needs mowed. Because the priority of production, which by the way, I'm doing for you. Yeah, I'm doing that. And that's, that's not the relationship. It's not production then connection. It's connection and then production.
Wow. You identified 5 destructive thought patterns. We may have touched on some of them already, but I wonder if you could outline them because, I think we all struggle with negative thoughts.
The 2 that we touched on, at least a little bit, was insecurity and distraction. The other 3 would be the pattern of pleasure, the pattern of despair, and then one that I think is especially relevant to those of us in leadership would be the pattern of offense. One of the things I learned about the pattern, like this thought pattern of being easily offended, is that being offended triggers, like in your brain, like dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin. So there's this weird, ironic addiction to being offended. Like there's something happening in your brain when you get offended that you like nobody wants
you
to.
Need to be. What do you mean
like
addiction? Like you need to be offended?
Well, that it triggers some of those chemicals in your brain. Like when you get offended, think in terms of like if you take it to the extreme, if you're in a fight, your adrenaline kicks in, and that there's something about that is addictive. And so when you get offended, nobody says, "Oh, I want to be offended," but there's something about us that is drawn to offense because we feel alive, and suddenly I can, I have something to blame, and I recognize within me, and within I think a lot of leaders is, there is there's the potential to take things personally a lot, and how we receive people, taking our thoughts captive when that initial offense happens is so important, but it can be that can be difficult to do.
What do you do when you feel like you've been offended?
Well, let me give you a couple things. You mentioned Ashley, our friend Ashley Woolridge, a few minutes ago. So he and I try to have a weekly phone call. And one of the things that we'll do in that weekly phone call, we have some questions that we work through, some accountability questions. But one of the things we'll do in that phone call is we'll tell each other this. And there is something about, telling someone else how someone offended you that makes you realize, I shouldn't have been offended by that. And by the way, there's something about telling him that, where, especially if it's very real or that hurt is, I don't want to minimize it. He gets it. He understands it. He knows what that's like. And so being able to say, hey, this was really hard because, these people, left the church and they were, I really cared about them. And then being pushed on that to recognize that them leaving the church feels offensive to me, makes me angry, but not really. It makes me sad, and saying it to him and sharing that with him helps me recognize that even though it feels like an offense, it just really makes me sad. So processing that with somebody that can, give you perspective is helpful. The other thing I think is a challenge if you're, under the spotlight and hearing from people that don't necessarily know you. I don't know who this was. I saw this, where a person said, I wish I could remember the source, but they said, if you have a problem with me, call me. If you don't have my number, then you don't have a problem with me. In other words, like you don't know me well enough. You don't know me well enough to be this upset with me. Why would you be upset? And I think when you're in the spotlight a little bit, there's a lot of that dynamic. I got a really harsh email from a church member a few years ago. Somebody I didn't know personally. It's very critical, and when I get something like that, I'll try to call them directly. And so I looked up his phone number, called him from the church phone. And when he answered, I was pretty fired up. I probably should have waited a day to do it, and I didn't. And when he answered, he asked, he must have saw it was from the church, right? And he said to me, "Are you calling about my son?" And I could hear in his voice there was a story there. I could hear the hurt or the brokenness. And I almost immediately, my heart shifted in that conversation. And I said, hey, this is Kyle from the church. I was actually calling to talk to you about the email you sent me, but first update me on your son. What's going on with your son? And he said, well, the hospital he was taken to after the overdose is telling us he needs to be transferred to an inpatient facility. We don't know where to send him. We don't have money to send him anywhere. And in that moment, like so much of my self-righteous offense, just kind of evaporated, right? And it was kind of a breakthrough moment for me on taking my thoughts captive, because I recognized God had given me a glimpse into that side of the story, and there's always that side of the story, even if I don't get to hear it. And so when I feel offended and I'm kind of caught up in that pattern, what helps me break that cycle is to stop and think. I remember that story, and I think to myself, okay, this person has that type of thing in their life, right? Like it may not be as dramatic, it may not be as obvious, they might not even be aware of it, but it's there. And God, give me a pastor's heart, for this person. Help me to see past the offense and understand it. And so to me, that's the taking your thought captive process. The neuroscientists call it the cognitive reappraisal, where you identify something and you say, okay, I'm going to acknowledge this. I'm not going to just say, don't feel that way. I'm going to intentionally replace it with something else. In this case, compassion.
Taking your thoughts captive means you have to also take responsibility for things you've done and said. What have been one or two of the hardest things you've had to admit or confess as a leader?
As a leader?
Yeah. Or in your life?
Yeah, let's stick to leader.
Stick to leader. Yeah, right. All right, we'll stick to leader. That's great.
I would say, well, I'll tell you a quick example of this, because the process of it is probably good. I a few years ago got into an argument with my wife, and I punched a hole in the door of a closet. And covered that up with a mirror, hoped she would forget about it and that we would never speak of it. Didn't want my kids to find out about it. Certainly did not want to be sharing it with you. And covered it up with this mirror. Then the mirror one night fell off the door and broke, kind of exposed that hole in the door. And I had this conviction because of what I was preaching on that weekend. I need to share this story. I don't want to. Oh, wow. And I thought to myself, I'm going to ask my wife for permission. She's going to tell me no, and then I can tell God, well, I wanted to. But, this woman that you gave me says you can't do it. And she said, well, if you feel like that's what God wants you to do, then that's what you should do. And so I stood up that weekend in church, and I told that story. And then afterwards, I was out in the lobby, and this guy came up to me who'd always kind of been a handshake guy, came over, gave me a hug, and he said, I've got a hole like that in the wall of my house. And kind of told me the story. It was a picture covering it. We talked for a few minutes. I look up, and there are 4 or 5 people in line, all of the same gender, by the way, just a bunch of men lined up. And they all have this, hole in the wall, hole in the door, hole in the dashboard of their car, which is pretty impressive, actually. They all have these stories of, and it just helped me recognize, man, in ways I wish it wasn't true. It is contagious that if you share, like, here's some of some of the things I've been struggling with. And I think that's true when it comes to, our thoughts, our insecurities, our struggles, being able to share that. And to me, the test of vulnerability, by the way, I don't know where I got this. It's not original, but it's like the vulnerability hangover, regret, like where after you share it, you wish you wouldn't have. You're like, I shouldn't have said that. To me, that you're not really vulnerable unless that's how you feel after you shared it. And I think as leaders, if you share vulnerably and you second guess it afterwards, it probably means you did it right. It probably means that was a good thing to share.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there are some leaders listening who are saying, I think I'd get fired if I shared that.
Mm.
Or they're really afraid of that kind of vulnerability. What would you say to them?
I would say, okay, so like this is hard. This one's hard for me. I had a friend, really good friend, say to me, he said, I feel like I find out about your struggles by reading about them in a book or listening to one of your sermons. What's he saying to me? He's saying, hey, we get together for breakfast. We sit on your front porch. You don't share those things with me, but you share them in the stage, or you put them in a book. And what I was confronted with was this question of, why is it harder for me to share it with him one-on-one than it is to stand up in front of a few thousand people? And it's because there's something, it's a different kind of vulnerability when you do that with a person. So I don't quite buy into the fact that we can't, maybe you can't do it from the stage at this point. There might be some discernment there, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it anywhere. It doesn't mean you can't. I mean, that's like when you get together with other leaders, there are certain things around that table that it's so helpful when somebody will be vulnerable, and they might not say it in front of their whole church.
Go first, right?
Somebody's got to go first, and it doesn't have to be in front of everybody. But I tell you what, if you do it with a few leaders, if you do it with a couple of your staff, if you with wisdom practice that with some of your volunteers, it'll start to change the culture in a way that when you stand up and do it, it won't be. It won't be as shocking, but I would just challenge people. And I mean, this is the personal journey is I need to do that with one person, before I do it with a bunch of people, and doing it with that one person is, it helps pave the way to do that in a way that is good for the community. So start with one person, but don't just say, well, I can't do that, and so I'm not gonna share it.
That's so good. I had a hole in the wall moment more recently than I want to admit. And it wasn't a hole in the wall, but it was something very similar. And I haven't told the story publicly yet, but what was different about this one was my wife called a friend, and I talked to the friend and her husband about it. And that is very different in the moment, raw.
Yes, it is.
Telling a friend. And the shame. And then, of course, we called my counselor, that kind of thing. And gosh, you're right. There's something about being public where it's easier to let that sit for 6 months, a year, or 5 years.
That's good. Yeah, that's right. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Tell it in a chapter of a book you're writing or a sermon, but in that moment, when the emotions are still all there, to invite someone into the confidence of that. I think that there is so much wisdom in that. And it breaks the cycle of shame. It breaks the cycle of, that's the first time I've talked about that. But the fact that there were friends and a couple of people really close to me who were there for us. Changes the dynamic.
Yes, it does.
Because it's almost like hide and then tell. Well, what if there's no hiding?
Oh, I think you're on to. I had not thought of it, but you're right.
No, but you
inviting somebody into the mess, inviting somebody into it before it's resolved, or this is the way I used to be. Inviting somebody
well, that was
into
me
it
at 2:00, but it's 3:30 now. So
years ago. Don't you mean yesterday?
Exactly.
But I think that's right. Like finding the courage to do that with someone in that moment. That's a really good challenge.
Yeah, or even if it's the next day or something like that, Kyle.
Yeah.
Man, this is so helpful. You let's talk about winning the morning. What do you do differently now to win the morning?
Well, one of the practical things that I am doing is so the two of my big takeaways from researching and studying this, both in Scripture and then scientifically is to recognize there's something about the morning time. And here's the other, just real practical thing, is there's something about saying certain things out loud, which is such a
like
biblical
declarations.
Kind of. I mean, yes, declarations. But I think there's part of us that says, well, it can feel a little, new agey or I'm manifesting something. That's not what I mean. I mean, like what God did with his people in the Old Testament, where they were to speak his word out loud at certain times of the day. And, it was to be out loud. And there's so it turns out there's science behind this, that you're engaging different regions of your brain. Like when my brain hears me say something out loud, it receives it differently than when I just think that thought in my head, which I didn't understand that, or, that there's this, reason why the Bible would put the emphasis on, hey, read God's word out loud, public reading of scripture, pray these prayers out loud. And so the two things that I feel like I tangibly shifted on is, having the morning, being intentional with morning time, and then just instead of just reading scripture or instead of just praying prayers, like I do it out loud now. I'll sit on my front porch or in the car or in the shower, and I try to say these things, speak God's word out loud. And so I'm just convinced there's some power that God has made us in such a way that when we speak his word out loud, that it engages our brain differently, that there's more power to it. And so, I would just challenge people who think that, well, maybe that's weird. Okay, well, just try it, just try it and see if there's an impact to it, because that certainly has been true for me.
No, that's a really, it's funny. I'm packing for this trip, and I've got Craig Groeschel's book with me, Winning the War in Your Mind, which I listened to a few years ago, but I want to really work through it. I think that's something that Craig talks about too, just actually stating it out loud. And you're right. We're like, I think silent prayer is a pretty recent invention. Almost everybody talked about it out loud for a long time. Any other disciplines, habits, things that you would recommend that would help us take our thoughts captive?
I didn't talk about this much in the book, but I am convinced that, so much of it should be rooted in gratitude. That there is something about a grateful leader that is really contagious. And so taking my thought, it can be a lot of different areas where I'm trying to, whether that's the pattern of, insecurity or distraction or pleasure or despair, but gratitude, grateful thoughts are a really powerful antidote to breaking these different patterns. And so I would say, just learning to practice grateful thinking is much more powerful than what we might realize. So I've worked at being, just more intentional with that, and I've been encouraged to see that there's something about grateful prayers that break down, these different strongholds in our lives. So I think the emphasis on gratitude is a great place to start.
I need more of that. I kept a gratitude journal for a few years, and I think I need to bring it back.
Yeah.
Particularly in a trying season. Kyle, the book is called Every Thought Captive. It's out, available everywhere. Man, I love your leadership. If people want to track with you online, where's a good place to find you these days?
I suppose places you would expect. Instagram, social media, or Facebook would be great.
Okay, awesome. Kyle, till next time. Thank you.
Thanks, brother. Great to visit with you.